Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today I'm making a simple enclosure for my Inventables X-Carve CNC machine. Check it out. Okay, so I got my Inventables X-Carve a little while ago. I've been using it. Everything has been great. Now, the only issue that I have with this machine and sort of with all of the router-based CNC machines is that the routers themselves are loud. You know, a router spindle is not necessarily quiet. It's not like a traditional motor spindle that you'd have on like a larger CNC machine. But the router is what makes these things affordable. It makes them easy to use, and it's an extremely versatile part of the CNC machine itself. So since I'm constantly recording video in the shop, the X-Carve running on its own in the middle of my shop like this was producing a little bit extra background noise. So I thought if I could build an enclosure that I could see into, it would help reduce the noise and it would keep any of the dust that might generate in here contained. That being said, I also have the dust chute on my machine, so that takes care of 99% of it. But I'm going to give you a little example of how loud the machine is, and then we're going to get into making it. So you can get an idea of how loud the router is before I close the lid. Now you can hear the difference. It totally cuts down on the noise and it makes it very easy for me to work and record voiceovers in the shop while the CNC is working. So let's get into building this thing. Okay, so starting off, I'm just taking some dimensions of the X-Carve in its current state. It's fully set up and I had been using it prior to building this. And I'm gonna have a Google SketchUp, a little plan in the description of this video that's gonna show the dimensions of my enclosure. I'm using a radiata pine from Home Depot, just 3/4 inch plywood, and I'm using my Makita track saw to break down all the sheet goods. Basically, I'm going to build the enclosure and then split it up once it's completed and all assembled. The enclosure itself has a top and the 4 sides, and then the bottom is going to sit underneath the machine. And I'm going to cut out some spaces for the wires and stuff to get out, and eventually cut in the window, and the plexiglass is going to be bent around the corner. The track saw makes quick work of plywood and any sort of sheet good operation that you need to do. It really just sort of saves you so much time. This whole thing does take 2 sheets of plywood, or it's like 1.5 sheets of plywood, because you need a 47 or 48 inch top and bottom because the machine is relatively large. I'm breaking down the plywood rips with the miter saw and just cutting them down to size. A little trick for cutting over the length of your saw is to lift up your material a tiny bit. Don't do this unless you're really experienced with your miter saw. It can be a little dangerous. You don't want anything to kick back on you. Once I get everything ripped down, I'm going to start assembling the box, and it's almost a square. It's a little bit smaller in one direction, and I'm just using brad nails and 1 5/8" screws to keep everything together. And I'm not using any glue on this just because I'm trying to build it fast and easy. What I like about this 3/4 inch plywood is it's generally pretty flat. The less expensive plywood can be really bowed. It's more made for sheathing and stuff where it's going to get nailed off. So if you can spend a little more money on something a little more finished, you can save yourself a lot of time and headache in terms of dealing with bowed and bent pieces of wood. Right now I'm just measuring out for the window that I'm going to be cutting in and figuring out what size piece of plexiglass I need, marking out my top and side piece, and I'm going to cut them using the track saw and get myself prepared to use the plexiglass to make my viewing window. Now, I think it's really important to have a viewport on any enclosure you're going to build for a CNC machine. You know, this is a cutter spinning at a high rate. There's pieces of metal in there. You could wind up with an error or something really dramatic can happen, and you know, you can have something go wrong, and you're going to want to see that right away. You're not going to want to have to open the enclosure first just to look inside if something's going bad. You want to be able to see what the problem is and shut the machine off if you have an issue. Just using the track saw to cut open a little U-shaped space so that I can have this viewport on both sides. I did a 14-inch cutout in the top and a 12-inch cutout in the face. And then I'm using a 42-inch wide by 30-inch tall piece of plexiglass that I got from my local hardware store. Before I get to using the plexiglass, I install the top with some more brad nails, and I'll go back and put some screws in there as well just to make sure everything stays nice and tight. Knowing that the top is square by cutting it with the track saw allows me to know that the sides are going to be square to it when I attach it. And here I'm splitting the box with the track saw again. Once it's fully assembled, I can just run the track across it on the 3 sides. And I use a little block here to keep it together as I'm cutting this. It just keeps the whole thing from falling apart. Bring it down and take that block out. Now I'm split into 2 pieces. And it'll allow me to install this piano hinge. And the piano hinge is going to be kind of important. The whole thing is pretty heavy. You're going to want a lot of support as you're pivoting this thing up. My original intention was to use some gas pistons to make this thing easier to raise and lower, but the pistons I bought just weren't strong enough. And then the larger pistons that I bought were too big to fit inside, so I wound up abandoning that idea. Now here's where the viewing port comes into play. I did some measuring, and my plexiglass is oversized, but using 2 heat guns, I'm going to bend this plexiglass so that I can get it around that corner and keep it as one solid piece. Now, I made a little bit of a mistake here. So what I'm doing is I have some 3/4 inch plywood straddling over the plexiglass, and that's supposed to keep it from bowing as I'm bending it. Unfortunately, the plywood wasn't rigid enough, so I wind up with kind of a weird warp in the center. If I was going to do this again, I would use a piece of 2x4 on edge so it was really rigid, and it would keep this thing from getting that strange warp in the middle. You can kind of see it developing. Overall, though, if you gently heat your material and just give it a little bit of pressure, you can get a really nice bend out of plexiglass. It's very, very seamless, no bubbling or anything like that. And then when you remove this plastic matting, you've got a perfectly clear viewing port that you can see through, and it really adds a nice little feature to this enclosure, kind of spruces it up and makes it look really slick. Now to attach the plexi, I just put some zip screws through it. It's important to use screws with a self-tapping head when you're screwing through plexi because you don't want to try and split through the plexi like you would split through wood. You want to drill a pilot hole first. So in this case, I did drill a small pilot hole and I still used the self-tapping screw just to make sure that I didn't crack the plexi. It was pretty expensive and I had just done all that work to bend it, so I really didn't want to break it at this port. And you can see how nice and clear that is. Now that door is pretty heavy, so I make some quick little brackets so that when the door is open all the way, it has somewhere to rest. I want the door to rest in an open position against the back section. So I make up some little corner brackets and I put in a 45-degree gusset so that they'll stay nice and strong, and I screw them to the back side of the enclosure. You can see the undersized gas piston in there. Once I realized that wasn't going to work, those just are going to get used for something else. So those little brackets are going to do exactly what I need. They're just going to keep this thing open. It's a little heavy to lift, but eventually I'll figure out a better way to use the pistons, or I'll get, the right size ones. Now over here, I'm cutting a small area for the cables and cords to get out of. I use a little block and screwed the 2 sides together so they would stay firm while I cut this with the track saw again. And I'm using my little Japanese saw to get this thing cut. Nice. And that's what happens when you don't take into account where your screws are. Now at this point, the top section is complete and I can basically install it. The bottom section is just a large piece of plywood that's going to sit underneath the sides of the top section. So I do some disassembly to the machine. I remove the motor controller and the servo stepper controllers and all that stuff. And then I have my friend Melissa come over and help me move the machine up into place, get everything on there. I didn't want to try and do it myself because I didn't want to rack any of the gantry or any of the sides. Now basically this thing is just going to sit on there, and for the moment the X-Carve is sort of just floating within the enclosure. Eventually I will drill and countersink some screws through the bed of the X-Carve into the plywood just to keep it from moving. It's important that it be in the proper position. The cabling and stuff and the cabling guides, they kind of bundle up as the machine moves, so I want to make sure that I have 100% mobility. The machine can properly move around without anything getting jammed or stuck. That's very important. You don't want to build this enclosure too small and then limit the usage of your machine. That would sort of defeat the purpose. In order to attach the top section to the bottom section, I use some simple angle brackets and some screws just to keep the top section from moving around every time I open and close that door. Really, the top section is only attached by the back side of it, so it's important to use a good amount of bracing and just make sure that this thing's not going to go anywhere. With this thing fully attached, I can install the vacuum hose, and I'm just taking a hole saw and drilling a hole through the top of the back section and routing some pipe clamps so that the hose can't fall. I don't want the hose to get in the way. And basically the machine has enough push that it can kind of move that hose around. Nothing's going to get jammed up. And I also explore the entire bed of the machine with the easel program that Inventables provides, and just make sure that everything can move freely and nothing's going to get jammed up. I can make all my connections again and do some test cuts, and I'm pretty much good to go. Okay, that about does it for this project. Just for some actual, I guess a little bit of science behind this, I'm going to do a quick decibel reading with my phone outside the machine and comparing the difference with the enclosure open and with it closed. So this is just like a decibel app for my iPhone. I'm going to rest it on here. So the ambient decibels in the ambient sound in the room is about 56 decibels. You turn on the router. So with the enclosure open, it was reading about 77 on the highest, and now I'm going to close it. And now we're down to about 68. So almost 10 decibels of difference, and you really notice it when you're in the other rooms. When this thing is running and the enclosure is shut, when I'm in the metal shop, I can barely hear that it's on. It's fantastic. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer them. I'm going to do a quick SketchUp model of this, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description of the video if you want to see the dimensions, what I used. Obviously, the plexiglass is optional, but I really think that it helps to be able to look in with a large viewing area, see exactly what's going on in case anything goes wrong during the cut. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram @MakeEverythingShop if you want to see what I'm doing day to day in the shop. I post on my story every day, and I always give a behind the scenes look when I'm working on projects, and I answer questions and give some insight into kind of what I have going on at that time. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stuff like this. I have a bunch of videos using the X-Carve and really pushing the limits of this machine coming up soon. Again, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks.